The food people choose to put in their bodies has the power to hurt or heal. Despite all the efforts that educate consumers on the importance of making healthy food choices, studies have shown that 80% of consumers are confused about food health information, with 59% of them doubting their choices. Who you seek food health advice from is as equally important as what you eat every day. The Be Fused podcast is a fusion of two ideologies: the culinary arts with the medical science, centered on helping individuals make more informed decisions about the foods they should eat daily. Our hope through listening to this podcast series is that we'll help individuals make more informed decisions that will positively impact their overall health. Welcome to the Be Fused podcast. For those of you who are new here, my name is Don, and I'm the host of the podcast. And I have my co-host on with me as well. Anthony Marota's here as well. And today we're going to be talking to Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. So Anthony, thanks a lot for bringing us together. I think this is going to be a really interesting overall podcast with Dr. Charlebois. He's a professor in food distribution and policy in the Faculties of Management and Agriculture at the Dalhousie University in Halifax. He's also the senior director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab, and he's the co-host of one of Canada's top-ranked podcasts in management called the Food Professor, which is a really interesting nickname. Maybe Anthony, we need an alternative for you, tagline name.
Definitely. Well, it's such a pleasure to have Sylvain on with us today in Canada. He's very recognized, and I'm so grateful that he's making the time to speak with us today. I think it's very timely, with a lot of the stuff that's going on, let's say post-pandemic, even though we're still kind of dealing with it, where we're seeing rising food costs and just a lot of consumer pressure. So I'm really, excited to have Sylvain on with us to discuss some of it. I know consumers are very concerned about rising food costs, and I think, on our end, this is something when we think of health and welfare of humanity, access to healthy food delivers a benefit is so critical to us as well. So I'm grateful to have Sylvain on with us today.
Yeah, great. And so with that, welcome, Dr. Charlebois.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Or should I call you the food professor?
Well, both. Depends. You seem to be doing a pretty good job with my name, Don. So you don't need to call me the food professor. But the nickname came about 20 years ago when I was giving a talk, and the person introducing me couldn't actually pronounce my name. He was the one that came up with the nickname Food Professor. And in the audience, there was a reporter from the Canadian Grocer, and after my talk, that reporter asked me to start a column for the Canadian Grocer called The Food Professor, and so it's stuck. So it's been 20 years.
Well, so for anybody that's watched, the things that I normally do in terms of these podcasts, the one common sort of thing is that my Indiana dialect follows me everywhere, and I can never seem to unlearn the things that I learned. So I'm glad that I've gotten this right a couple times, but it has taken a full day of practice. So yes.
Good job, Don. Good job.
Yes. So I tried to cover your bio, but at the same time, there are tons of things that you've done in this space. Can you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually, before I became an academic, I was actually a lobbyist in the food industry many years ago. And as a lobbyist, you kind of have to understand food systems. You have to understand who has power, who's influencing who actually is influenced as well. And I did that for a few years in the province of Quebec, and met a mentor and brought me back to school to do my master's and PhD eventually. And of course, my focus was very much the political economies of food, and that really influenced and inspired my work as a food distribution and policy expert. So I look at both government and business together, how the nexus of both, and how disruptive forces can actually impact distribution of food from both ends of the food continuum. So a lot of people are wondering, well, what you talk about a lot of things. Well, we do, because everything is interconnected. I mean, look at Ukraine, for example. I mean, a lot of people thought, well, Ukraine is far away; it's not going to impact us. Well, it impacted the entire planet, and
Yeah.
so to different degrees, of course, but it did impact the entire planet in some way. And so that's really what we do. In Canada specifically, most of our work is in Canada. We actually look at consumer perceptions. We also look at policy. We've worked with, I think, 7 provinces in the last 5 years now. The federal government, of course, Ag Canada, Health Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Bank, we actually advise the Bank of Canada on inflation, and we also have worked with the Office of the the um, the person involved with the verifications in Ottawa, the Auditor General of Canada. Sorry, I had the French word in mind, but the Auditor General of Canada has asked us to review programs related to COVID. I think it was last year, to see whether or not food programs during COVID were well executed.
And so, what was the end answer on that? Just out of curiosity.
It was, you have to understand context. Of course, if you remember back in 2020, it was pretty chaotic. I mean, a lot of
Mm,
people just didn't know what was going on.
right.
In the Western world, we didn't know what this beast was, this COVID thing. Everything was being shut down. You saw an entire sector of food service being shut down. A lot of lives were disrupted within days, and so uh, when you appreciate the context, you have to. Uh, we did actually register some sympathy towards the government in terms of how the money was spent, but they were programs that weren't necessarily great, like fisheries and seafood. It wasn't really well done. The money went to the wrong places, but the support that was provided to, say, food banks, food rescuing agencies, we felt that was money well spent.
That's great. That is great. I mean, I just I mean, there's a lot of good lessons learned that I think a lot of us could have walked away from, just what we experienced with COVID, because um yeah, I mean, we all sort of know the reality is that there could be another one of these things that comes along at some point that sort of forces everything shut again, and it'd be nice
Let's
to know
hope
that we've
not.
learned our lesson and we're moving it forward. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So in my intro of you, I mentioned the Agri-Food Analytics Lab. What is the focus of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab?
Well, so we were formed based on a partnership between three faculties: management, computer science, and agriculture. And the idea was to actually bring some data science to agriculture. So understanding consumers, understanding the work being done, but most importantly, forecasting, using machine learning to forecast. And so the one document that is viewed quite significantly, not only in Canada but around the world, is Canada's Food Price Report, which we created about 13 years ago now, I guess. And Canada's Food Price Report is our forecast for the next 12 months in terms of what's going to happen with food prices. And so in December, we released Canada's Food Price Report, and the market reach was over 600 million people, according to Meltwater. So that document is well read. It's indexed in different provinces, of course, in Ottawa as well. And the whole idea of the report really is to get people engaged in talking about the future of food. Obviously, this year is, I mean, the focus is very much about prices and what's going to happen. And in December, what we did was we provided a forecast. Again, a very um, unfortunate forecast, because we were basically telling Canadians that that food prices would go up by 5 to 7% again, and we're seeing it right now. I mean, we're seeing it that it's not over. There's still a lot of issues that we need to deal with supply chains and everything else, and so we are expecting a very difficult winter, spring. But once we get to the summer, we do expect that food systems will somewhat be more normalized, and things will calm down a little bit. Those, and to actually get to that forecast, we work with Guelph, we work with Saskatchewan, we work with UBC. We always work with other universities, and we try to get data as much as possible to historical data to basically set ourselves a path to better understand what lies ahead.
Very interesting. Any questions from your side, Dr. Marotta?
Sorry, I was just on mute. As it relates to pricing, and indexing, of food, just kind of thinking, out loud a bit. Obviously that translates to the consumer, and so I presume too, like in terms of pricing indexes and everything, there's obviously a consumer aspect to that. And do you guys also liaise then with government to highlight some of the concerns that the consumer may have through some of those initiatives that you guys are working on?
Oh, absolutely. Right now, we actually have four projects with three provinces. So we have Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario, and all projects are related to food security, food autonomy, local foods, the localization of food, if you will. So there is more interest in local foods and food resilience per se. And so discussions we've had with provinces aren't the same as before COVID. Things have completely changed. Um, Provinces are aware that we need to produce more food. We need to become more autonomous. But food autonomy in Canada is not like in the US. I mean, you can't really just think about feeding yourself. You have to feed other markets as well in order to build economies of scale. So instead of just thinking about, I don't know, growing strawberries, for example, in Quebec, they're thinking about Maine and New Hampshire and New York and different places where you could actually, sell and promote some products. So the language has really shifted, and that's the kind of projects we're involved with. The other issue, of course, is affordability. It's great that you can produce, but you have to make sure that also prices are affordable and stable as well. And so this is certainly something that is becoming more and more of a priority for governments, which are trying to find solutions to offset the impact of food inflation, even though Canada actually has one of the lowest inflation rates in the world. In the G7, you have right now you have Japan with a lower food inflation rate, and now the U.S. Before January, U.S. was above us, but now it's below.
Well, wow. I guess just sorry, Don, just to
Good.
interject too. One thing, again, that we're thinking of, related to, I guess, the economic situation is when we look at healthcare spend. And there's enough data to, cite this or purport this, that again, access to healthier foods does provide a tangible health benefit. And so I'm waiting patiently for the intersection of two ideologies where we can actually offer people healthier food that's more affordable, with the view then of like preventing chronic diseases, so to speak, and then saving from traditional healthcare budgets. So I don't know, like on your guys' end, are you seeing the two groups coming together, to look at this as part of the solution?
We're trying. We're trying. In fact, on March 9th, our next report will be about Canada's food guide. As you know, Canada's Food Guide is the most downloaded document offered by the government of Canada after uh, the income tax return form, of course. Um, so, so the food guy comes second. It's consulted a lot. So we know that 4 years ago, when the new food guide came out, which was very different. If you've seen it,
Yeah.
you'll see it's a complete departure from what we used to have. The food guide that was introduced back in 2006. And there's more plant-based, more vegetable proteins. The drink of choice is no longer milk; it's water. Lots of changes there. So what we did in 4 years ago was to approach Health Canada and ask them whether or not they assessed the affordability of the new guide, and the answer was no. And so they actually asked us to do that work 4 years ago, and that work is published now. But 4 years later, after the pandemic, Ukraine, and everything else, we've decided to go back to the drawing board and compare both food guides. So on March the 9th, we'll be presenting a new report comparing both guides.
Okay. Interesting.
Very interesting. So, I wanted to also come back to your podcast as well, the Food Professor. What can you tell us about the show, and what are the topics that you generally cover on the podcast?
Well, so first of all, my partner in crime, Michael LeBlanc, he's the brainchild behind the idea. I mean, I when he approached me a few years ago to do a podcast, I told him I don't know anything about podcasts, and I felt, frankly, I think there's too many of them. There's a lot of them, and I don't listen to many podcasts myself, and I didn't see how I could actually get a new audience. I publish in the Globe and Mail. I have a column in La Presse every week for the last 20 years. I was very comfortable with the audience, but Michael convinced me just after the start of COVID. He asked me, "Well, you're not traveling anymore. You have time, I guess." And so I said, well, okay, let's try it. But I can't do more than one episode every 2 weeks, and so we'll have a guest, and that's about it. And it was a lot of fun. It's been fun, and so much fun that we've really we've gained a new audience. I feel like every time I go out, people are telling me, "Oh, I've listened to your podcast. Great interview with such and such," and we've had some great guests too. I mean, it's funny because we've had Michelin star chefs, we've had CEOs of major grocery companies, CEOs of processing companies. We've had farmers, of course, that are managing millions and millions of dollars of inventory. So it's been really fantastic. And so recently, because of our success in the rankings, we've decided to go ahead and record one episode a week now. So and we have a backlog of guests up until, I think, until November or December of this year. So we're pretty busy.
That's a good problem to have. That definitely is a good problem to have for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of the way that you sort of break down topics, I mean, in reference for this show, I know that Dr. Marotta and I were looking at a lot of the things that you publish as well on LinkedIn. It seems like you've got, kind of a broader range of topics that you seem to address in the space as well.
Absolutely. And the first thing I try to think about is, what do people care? Like, what
Mm.
do people care? I care about things, but it doesn't really matter unless people actually care. What are people concerned about? What do they want to learn? And so I pick a topic every week. I look at topics, and it may actually be something that's happening right now in the news, or it may be something that I think is important to talk about, like right now, that is not in the news. So once in a while, I go out and we kind of create news, I guess, but you can't create news if you don't have any data. That's the key. Yeah, you both of you are researchers. You know this. If you don't have any numbers, if you don't have any evidence, new evidence, unpublished evidence, and that's where the lab comes in. Well, then it becomes a story, becomes interesting, and people want to know more about the story. So we've done just recently the one topic that nobody was talking about in the grocery industry was the cashless economy. You know what's happening right now when you go to a grocery store and cash is no longer king. And the one thing that I've actually realized in my research is that most Canadians don't know that grocery stores don't have to accept cash in Canada. It's legal tender, but they don't have to accept cash. So it is possible one day to see grocery stores refusing cash. So how does that work when you have many on banks or under banks, as we call them, and that's basically almost 2 million people in Canada. And so we talked about discrimination. We talked about the underprivileged. We talked about, you know, privacy issues because when you give a piece of plastic to a grocer, you're giving a part of yourself too. And a lot of people are talking about cyber attacks these days, and so we got people to think about what does a cashless economy mean to grocery shoppers, and so we got into several conversations with different media outlets and different academics, which was great.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly ties to the question I heard Dr. Marotta asking a minute ago around, equality and access, just being a challenge for somebody that maybe doesn't have a credit card because, frankly, one, they don't need it. And two, they sort of, maybe it's a challenge for them to get one as well. So.
Exactly, and so we actually believe that about 6% of the Canadian population are either underbanked or unbanked. So that's quite a lot of people, you
Yeah.
know. So as a policymaker, you have to think about that, and you can see with self checkouts and everything else that's going on at the grocery store, you can see that at some point. I mean, in our survey, we actually realized 75% of Canadians actually think that within 5 years, grocery stores are going to be cashless. So it's not something that is impossible. It is quite possible, but at the end of the day, it is about food. You're selling food, which is a necessity of life. It's not like selling tires or T-shirts and go cashless and not allowing your store to be accessible. A grocer has some moral duty, which goes back to this inflation thing, and a lot of people are pointing fingers at grocers saying they're responsible for inflation. I kind of laugh because when you look at food sales in Canada, the growth of food sales aren't even following the inflation rate. So you got to wonder. I mean, they are making money, but selling lipsticks and T-shirts, and so when you go into the data, but people are quick to blame grocers specifically for the ills of society, and you kind of have to be careful, and you need data essentially.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, so this comes back to the researcher in me, right? So there are hypotheses that you can form based on a lot of these things. Like, are there people that maybe are benefiting from, a supply chain shortage potentially, but also would they benefit from, sort of making sure that the supply chain's full on their side as well? For sure. So, there's just all these things that you'd have to sort of go through and test and understand, like what exactly is happening. Because as we started our conversation, we were talking about COVID. The first supply chain shortage that I remember with COVID was toilet paper. Of all things, it
That's
was
right.
toilet paper. And it's like, how the heck how do we run out of toilet paper? You got to be kidding me. And
Yeah.
then, lately here in the U.S. where I'm in Colorado, it's been eggs. Eggs have been, really hard to come by, and then they're high priced whenever you do come by them, as a follow up. But it seems like, yeah, there's a lot of things that you have to try and understand from the government perspective. but also the agriculture and kind of the grocery level as well. What exactly is happening that are causing these things that we can't seem to recover from? So,
That's right. At the very beginning of COVID, I actually had hope. For the first time, I mean, I've studied supply chains and logistics for the longest time, and I've always felt that people think of these topics as being quite boring. It's not sexy. It's fun to talk about brands and trends and packaging and consumer behavior, and those were fun to talk about. But logistics and supply chains, not really. But as soon as people saw empty shelves at the grocery store, they were asking questions about supply chains and logistics. And I thought, to me, it was exciting because for the first time, I actually was dealing with an audience that believed that food doesn't really magically appear on store shelves. You know, there's work, and so I felt very happy and relieved and encouraged by the discussions that I had. But in recent months, I've been discouraged by how linear the thinking behind accusing grocers actually is. I mean, it's I understand why people are blaming grocers because that's their portal to the food space for them. It's the only thing that they understand. But to basically point fingers at grocers without really understanding what goes on before food actually arrives at the grocery store is a little premature, and I just wish people would be. I hate to say this, but I wish people would be less data literate or less data lazy
oh,
to
right.
really
Mm-hmm.
understand
Sure.
what actually is going on up the food chain.
Yeah. Which kind of ties to the next question. I really wanted to dig in with you a little bit. So, in your opinion, what role should governments and policymakers play in promoting healthy and sustainable eating habits?
Well, I mean, the food guide is certainly a good start in my view. I mean, that's probably the strongest statement you can make as a government is to actually establish a food guide. And a lot of people just roll their eyes. Oh my God, the food guide, nobody follows it. Well, it gets institutionalized. Like kids are actually looking at this thing now, and as you grow, you will be influenced by the food guide. My generation were influenced by the four food groups, and just by the looks of you guys, I suspect that you're old enough to have been influenced by older food guys than the new ones, especially in Canada, and that's really the reality. I think it's that, and the other issue is labeling. I think so. You
Yeah.
got the food guide as a very powerful instrument, and labeling is another one. And let me give you an example of one thing that Ottawa got right. So on January 30th of last year, the government actually adopted a food of front of package labeling rule, which will be put into force in about 3 years from now in Canada. So on as you walk into a grocery store, on packages you'll see clearly big logos telling you whether or not a product has too much fat, too much sugar, or too much sodium.
Mm,
Within seconds, it will tell you. And to me, that's a winning way to do things, to actually do two things. One, you change behavior, but two, you empower industry to change, to reformulate, to actually offer healthier products because everyone is dealing with the same rule. It's a level playing field for everyone. So you can't cheat on sodium, you can't cheat on fat, you can't cheat on sugar. It's all the same. And to me, and what we've seen in Europe is a policy that works very well. It makes our food healthier. The food we have access to is healthier, and at the same time, consumers get educated in terms of what's actually in their food. So, to me, those are the two most powerful instruments you have for people who don't have the time to get educated. Now, education itself, of course, is I'm in the business of education myself, so obviously I believe in education, but not everyone can actually afford the time to get educated or to read. So to me, the point of purchase and the food guide, undeniably powerful.
yeah. And then you have an article, I believe, coming up. I saw it was set for March 9th is what I saw on LinkedIn related to the food guide. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the focus of that will be? Is it some of the talking points that you just used?
Yeah, well, I just spoke about it earlier, actually. So we've compared the old and the new food guide. And so we did that 4 years ago when the new food guide came out. And now we're doing it again after all the mess we went through in recent years, supply chains, Ukraine, COVID, everything. And so we just wanted to see uh, how affordable the food guide is. So to us, it's a must. If you present a food guide that is not affordable, or even Canadian, I mean, there's some avocados in there and almonds. Canada doesn't produce almonds or avocados, so. So that's the other thing that we've mentioned to Health Canada. I mean, are you sure you want to promote these products? We don't really make them here. So they surrounded themselves with like-minded people, well-intended people. Actually, 13 dietitians and nutritionists. I've actually published personally with three of them. Great people, very competent, but they all come from the same school, and they all think alike. So they don't think about the economics of food at all. They just think about nutrition, and so it's scientific. Their approach was scientific, scientifically sound, but it wasn't comprehensive for the consumer.
Mm. Yeah, because whenever it's challenging to find something that's in a guide or that is being readily talked about, you of course would want to make sure that it's also available. One of the things that I remember hearing quite a few years ago, I mean, it's somewhat related to this topic, is the largest sort of consumers of U.S. cranberries was Sweden at the time. Now, I don't know if that, I don't know the numbers behind it or anything else, but I can only imagine being Swedish and, looking at, again, cranberries where they're, the largest amount of them that are consumed inside of the country might actually even be, shipped in and
That's
as
right.
an import, right? And so,
Yeah.
so again, how accessible are they, and how do they make it out to the kind of larger population? I have no idea, but yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think a lot of people are asking themselves questions about trades, and the one thing that concerns me right now is are the geopolitics of the world. I mean, actually, I'm writing a book right now on food geopolitics. So is our world shrinking or becoming more or becoming broader? Are we going to be trade? Is this the end of trade essentially, global trades? And because you got to wonder what's going on with some near shoring and onshoring. A lot of companies are opening different plants at different places to produce food locally. It's happening in Canada. It's happening elsewhere. So what's the deal here? And I think right now we're going through a very historical phase uh, that is between gl- the belief of global trade versus a more localized food system to service different populations around the world. China has a big say on that. You know that China is becoming more autonomous. It just built a 26 floor hog barn to produce 1 million pigs a year. I mean, how can you imagine? It's just incredible what they're doing in China right now, and because they want to become autonomous. They're producing everything there, and so what lies ahead? And a lot of people are saying we have a polarized world. Actually, I don't think it's polarized. I think it's just multifaceted. During the Cold War and right after, it was pretty simple. You were either for the U.S. or against the U.S. Now there's China, there's Russia, there's India, there's Europe, there's Australia and Brazil and the US, of course. And for us Canadians, it was so easy to guess or second guess the Americans because they liked us. Now it's not an automatic anymore because of all the things happening around the world. And I think it's going to impact our food systems over time, with whom we trade, to whom we sell. We're selling more canola to Mexico now, which is interesting. So our reliance on the U.S. is a problem. It was a problem before, but now it is really a weakness that we have that is being recognized by many policymakers.
Very interesting.
You know,
How
one
Go
comment
ahead.
on mine, third, Don, just looking at these regional strategies in terms of like nutrifying people, I think it'll be interesting from a microbiome perspective. You know, when I look at food, and I think we don't know enough about the influence of food on the gut microbiome. We're seeing, you know, some evidence where again processing of foods and you know the additives and everything can actually influence the biome. So I'm kind of intrigued from a scientific standpoint to look at when we regionalize it, what do we actually do to people's biomes? Do we actually improve people's biomes? You
Yeah,
know,
that's
and I,
very true.
you know, so the science, you know, I'm excited for the science, but I understand all the geopolitical issues that arise, you know, out of this. But I am more becoming more and more of a proponent for more of a regionalized strategy as well, you know, for access, just because of you know the presumed benefits to the microbiome. So I don't know if you have any comments or thoughts on the microbiome, you know, in of itself.
The health issue is a big one. I mean, it will drive decisions, whether it's personal decisions related to food or even deliberate public state decisions. I actually do think that health, and we're talking a lot about mental health these days, and that's not going to go away. I think that COVID has damaged a good portion of a younger generation. We have 4 kids at home, and I can tell you, we see it. I mean, COVID really damaged them in terms of how they see society, how they assess risks, how they interact with people, and yes, how they eat, and what benefits they seek from eating as well. So I actually think that health is going to become even more important as we move forward.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the interesting part to me, Dr. Marotta, is given our background in diagnostics and in life sciences as well. You know, anytime that you have a diagnostic today, let's say if I wanted to release that diagnostic somewhere in Asia, you'd have to go test the Asian population. They won't let you just take something that is, you know, only tested in North America now and go release it in other parts of the world. On the other side, you know, you kind of, you know, I guess the part that I've lived with for a major part of my life is just allergies, you know, seasonal allergies, and oftentimes people will say, you know, consuming things like honey and you know things like that that are local, you know, also will help you with your allergies. And I half wonder, you know, at the end of the day, would a diet that you know solely is made up or in large part is made up of your local you know produce and you know other goods you know would at the end of the day help your microbiome. So for sure it mentally makes a lot of sense. It's just one of those things that would be interesting to see how it actually plays out you know as we continue forward as well.
I mean,
Yeah,
the one comment that I have there is again, we see it with other species where the environment influences, you know, different parameters, and there's epigenetic effects, you know, due to the environment. So, what makes humans any different in that regard? And so I think, yeah, eating for your environment, you know, it's not rocket science, you know, so to
No.
speak.
Yeah. Yeah, and it would kind of go back to you know what you would envision would be our natural state anyway. This is
yeah,
the
absolutely.
Go, so, Dr. Charlebois, this is my last question for you. So, how can consumers make more informed decisions when it comes to choosing healthy and sustainable food options?
Well, I mean, it's really a matter of democracy. I mean, food democracy to me is very important. I think for a very long time, the agri-food sector was stuck in this stomach share mentality because we basically produce food and we found a market for that food, and we'll figure out the rest. That was going on for centuries, really, up until after the Second World War, when all of a sudden we realized that not all of us are the same. We actually have different needs, different tastes. And so you saw this hyperfragmentation of demand forcing the industry to start, looking for different opportunities. And that's when we start to see the organic movement, gluten free, and fair trade, all the things that people care about has come about. So the stomach shared paradigm really forced companies to think about, a win-lose scenario. If I actually get into someone's stomach, it means that the other company or the other commodity won't get into that stomach. I win, you lose. We're not there anymore. We're not there anymore. I actually think that we have a much more fragmented marketplace, and it's all about value, perceived value. And in my view, it's not necessarily just uh, about stomachs. It's about value and providing something unique. And that's how health is going to cut through that aspiration of leading a healthier lifestyle is going to cut through right there. It's going to be presented to different folks, in my view, anyways. And so instead of just looking at the consumer as someone consuming calories, it's more about choice. And inflation is going to play a big part, by the way. It's costing more. So instead of spending 9% of your money on food, you're going to be spending 12%. Well, if you're spending 12%, stakes are higher, expectations are different. People want something back for their money. And if there's something they want back, is certainly health. They want something
Mm,
that tastes good, and they want something that's healthy. And if you actually can combine both, then you got a winning combination.
yeah.
Yeah.
And Dr. Marotta, I mean, this is where, at least in my mind, it kind of ties back to the scoring system that you have, and with Project Healthy Human as well.
Yeah, yeah. So on our end, just kind of very, very briefly too, we completely agree with you. And having worked so many years in the IBD space or in the diagnostic space, developing methods to actually, how shall I put it, establish the healthiness index of a food is so critical. I know that there's other things that are out there, but if I look over the course of the last 20 odd years in terms of what has changed, in again looking at data from some of the global consortiums that are looking at access to ultra processed foods, we know that arguably ultra processed foods are a big thing, and I see that even intersecting in the whole plant-based movement, where again you're just strapping on like a label, so to speak, and calling it plant-based. Well, from a health and clinical perspective, that not everything is created equally, and it's all the whole rich, plant rich foods that people should be consuming. But again, we're seeing all this ultra processing stuff. So on our end, one of the things that we really want to do is continue to train our scoring system to be able to then establish that point of credibility and trust that here's a score. If the product scores X, well, you know what, it's good for you. If it scores Y, it's bad for you. And to take subjectivity out of the equation to make it easier for the consumer to make more of an informed decision. And I think on our end, from a clinical perspective, that's what, with all of our knowledge and our team, that's what we can bring to the table, so to speak, to make it more equitable, and to help the consumer make that decision. So we're excited to continue to work on that as a team, and we hope that the food industry will be open, and governments will be open to collaborating with us as well on something like that.
No, absolutely. I think there's some great opportunities that, like I said, the more you uh, the more you recognize the differences, the more you recognize the heterogeneous nature of a market, the more opportunities you'll recognize. And you'll need different products. The plant-based movement was, to me, was it was an interesting phenomena, but it really started in a wrong fashion. I think it was intended to replace something people love, meat, for example, and it's even higher price. And as you said, it's processed, and so the design of it was not well thought of, and now they're paying for it. You can see what's going on with Beyond Meat and Impossible, and
Yeah.
but vegetable proteins aren't dead. I mean, they're actually going to
Yeah.
be there. It's going to
Yeah.
stay. It just needs to be, the nomenclature of it needs to be massaged a little bit.
Yeah, completely agree with you. Again, I think there's enough systematic studies and meta-analyses that cite that, putting patients on a plant-rich diet actually provides a tangible benefit. But again, I think related to labeling, you can't call everything plant-based or plant-rich.
Well, I mean, when you talk to, I was in Red Deer last year talking to 700 ranchers, and I was talking about the plant-based movement, and I was basically explaining the difference between the plant-based movement and the vegetable protein movement, which are two different things.
Yeah.
And one rancher with his cowboy hat went to the mic and said, "Well, beef is plant-based, isn't it?" So the nomenclature needs work.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So, Dr. Charlebois, as we get ready to close, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about where people can find out more information about you and your books as well as your podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So easy. You just go on Google and you Google Agri-Food Analytics Lab, Dalhousie University, and you'll find us. All of our research is available in both English and French for free. And if you want to find out more, my coordinates are there. My team's coordinates are all there. So if you need more information, we'll be more than happy to respond. As far as books goes, I'm writing my 8th book right now on food geopolitics. My last book actually was it's in French. It's called The Protein Revolution. That's why actually I do talk about the plant-based movement and how it's failing, why it's failing. So very relevant to the discussion we just had. But that book came out this year, and my next book is coming out in September.
And I noticed on Amazon as well, you have a book on poutine there as well, which is important in
Oh,
Canada, also. So there we go. Yes. Yeah. I had
Poutine,
to.
Poutine Nation. That's right. So it's the story of, it's the history of poutine and how it became a world known dish. Because I actually, so as you guys do, you go to conferences around the world, and for 1 year, every time I went to a conference, didn't matter around the world, I went to the front desk and asked where I can get poutine. And I had poutine easily in Cleveland, New Orleans, in Los Angeles, in Lille, France, in Frankfurt, Germany, in Shanghai, China, Brisbane, Australia, easily. They knew exactly what I was talking about.
And for anybody
And
that visits, you got to make sure you have it as
yeah,
well. Sorry, I interrupted you,
yeah,
Dr.
no,
Murray.
I was going to ask which place made it the best.
Well, I'm from Quebec, so it's hard to find a good decent poutine outside of Quebec. But I must say
Certainly.
the worst, hands down, it's the one in Cleveland.
Ah,
The one in Cleveland was the most bizarre experience I've ever had. So it was the middle of the afternoon, so I come in, there was nobody because I wanted to go to restaurants where I had time to interview the owners,
yeah.
and they served me this poutine with a wine-based sauce, fries,
Okay.
of course, and the cheese was mozzarella powder.
Oh my.
Oh, that doesn't
So
sound good.
yeah,
No.
so I couldn't. I was polite. I tried a few bites and that was fine. And then I interviewed the owner, and it was a dad and a father and daughter restaurant, and they both told me that for them that's poutine. So there you go.
Wow.
And that's the beauty of it. It's like pizza. Canadians actually, if you go to Napoli, Italy, and you tell them that in Canada we actually put pineapple and ham on pizza, and we call it a Hawaiian pizza, invented in Chatham, Ontario. They they take it as an insult, but it happened. We actually created something out of pizza for ourselves because we grow pineapple in Canada, plenty of it.
Wow. Who would have thought? I didn't know that one. I learned something new in the podcast.
There you go. But pizza has a very similar story to poutine, by the way. It's 3 ingredients, and it came really. It was actually seen as a dish for the poor. Poutine was actually a vulgar, simple dish for blue collar workers in rural Quebec, and it was the same for pizza. But it got globalized through immigration. With poutine, it got really globalized due to American chains like Harvey's, McDonald's, and Burger King. They were forced to adopt poutine because in the region of Quebec, too many people were asking for it, and that's how it became famous.
Well, you can't go to Quebec without finding it. So I've been before and actually
That's right.
have had it in Quebec as well.
And
So,
at our age, it takes about 3 weeks to digest, but hey, it's
It's
all
okay.
worth it. All worth it.
Yes, for sure.
It's funny, we spend 45 minutes talking about health, and we spend the last few minutes talking about one of the most disgusting, unhealthy dish in the world.
I'm sure
Well,
it will improve our ratings overall with the podcast.
well,
So,
you know, the one thing though I'll say about that too, as it relates to eating, it's not just about obviously eating healthy food. It's also about the enjoyment, right? So
That's
again,
right.
once in a while, maybe we'll let everyone know that it's okay once in a while to have something that guilty pleasure, that you actually
That's right.
enjoy. So have your
right.
poutine or your pizza.
Right,
Well,
exactly.
thank you so much. I'll take advantage of that.
Well, Dr. Charlebois, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us. We greatly appreciate you being here on Be Fused, and thanks a lot, Dr. Marotta, for being a great co-host with me. I greatly appreciated our conversation.
All right, take care.
All right, thank you. Thank you for listening to Be Fused. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with the guests, and more episodes, please visit www.projecthealthyhuman.ca. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let us know by sending a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe in your favorite podcast app, share and tell a friend about it, and last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.